Hello everybody, and it's good to be with you again on this Thursday. Generally we look at a portion of the Gospel of Matthew on these Thursdays, and I'll start that again next week. I paused this week because I was wanting to go back and look at that passage in 2 Thessalonians that I skipped past in my sermon series. And that passage is 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, 1 through 12. So if you would, just go ahead and pause the video. Go ahead and read that passage. Again, it is 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, 1 through 12. It's a very mysterious passage, but go ahead and read that, and then after you finished reading it, go ahead and start the video back up again. Okay, I'll assume that you have read this passage. So, one of the problems, I guess, as far as like trying to understand exactly what all is going on here, is that Paul doesn't have all the information. In fact, he knows there's been some misinformation that has affected this church. And if you look at verse 1, and verses 1 and verse 2. So he's talking about stuff that he's talked about in 1 Thessalonians, the return of the Lord, the end of time. And there's been some misinformation that has went out. He gives three sources, either by spirit, or by a message, or by a letter. So this information has went out. It's caused problems. Someone seems to be speaking in behalf of Paul. And so there's a major problem with that. So Paul has to correct all this information. So first he says, he gives these three things. So by spirit. So I guess it'd be the idea of making a claim that the Holy Spirit led them to make some kind of declaration about the end of time. And so what the misinformation it seems to be here is that people think that the Lord has returned and they missed out. Something to that effect. So maybe someone says, I received this from the Holy Spirit. No. In fact, this would be a good example of in 1 Thessalonians 5, I think what really is being talked about there when it says do not quench the spirit. I think it's talking about the individual there. It's not talking about the group. It's talking about the individual who claims to be speaking by the Holy Spirit. And sometimes that person needs to understand is that maybe the Holy Spirit's telling them not to speak. And so you're not listening. So you're quenching the guidance, the fire, the guidance of the Holy Spirit, that kind of idea. But anyway, if it's not true. Even if you claim it's been given to you by the Spirit, that's not true. A spoken word, some kind of information has been, somebody's learned something, or they claim to be speaking in behalf of Paul, as if this is a message directed from Paul to them. And lastly, by letter. Now maybe here's another instance of maybe a letter that went out. We don't know. I don't know if Paul knows for sure. It seems like he's pretty unsure because he gives us three different areas that this trouble could come from. But anyway, someone maybe tried to send a letter out in the name of Paul. Point is that misinformation has hurt this church, and Paul doesn't know where the misinformation has come from. So he sets about to try to correct this, and so he wants to correct some information about the eschaton. Eschaton is a way for us to talk about the end of time. And so he's trying to correct some information about that eschaton, that moment of finality, So, now in verse 5, you look at verse 5 real quick, he says that he's talked about this stuff with them before. There's some information here that we just don't have all the information. That's another thing. So, it very well could be, in this instance, that people have taken Paul's instructions and muddled them. This would be very, very feasible, reasonable. This is probably the best explanation anyway. Many times people don't listen very well and they don't process information very well. And so they receive little bits of information and they tend to try to be economical in the way that they go about this. Instead of being industrious and trying to research and find the answers without any kind of uncertainty, they chalk things together. They just start chalking things together, just building things together that may not necessarily be true. And I think probably that could be a good example. Paul has taught something, somebody's heard it, They've muddled it in their mind, and now they're going out and spreading misinformation. Not that they meant to, but they just don't have the right understanding. That's exactly what's going on in 1 John. So I know that's very reasonable. People not knowing all the information, going out and trying to teach. And man, that causes lots of trouble back then. It causes lots of trouble now. It's still causing trouble all the time. So he's trying to get them straightened out, and also the problem, I guess, here also is that when they're giving this misinformation, there's no accountability. So Paul's trying to provide a mechanism of accountability here. They should have been talking to Paul before they ever started sharing this information. Something's happened here, and things have broken down. So now, as I said, there's just so much in here that just makes you ask more questions than there are answers for. We're only getting one part of the conversation. So Paul doesn't know what's all's going on here. He seems to be generalizing some things. And also, as I said, we only have one side of the conversation. We don't have what the Thessalonians have been discussing with Paul. All we have is what Paul wants to offer in return. So we don't have that. We have to gather information. We have to gather facts. So we need to gather some historical information about Thessalonica, and a good place to start is just to read the passage in Acts about Paul's ministry here. It'd be Acts chapter 17. Begin there, and then just do some general historical sources too. You can read about first century living, so forth and so on, Greek culture. But you need to accumulate lots and lots of facts. You've got to engage the original languages. Our English translations are just not very accurate many times, guys. And so if you can't read the original languages, you need to be looking at least 4 or 5 different English translations, because they're not all going to be the same. And where there are differences, that gives you the key to understand that, hey, here's something I need to look at a little bit more closely, or ask someone who knows what's going on to help me understand this a little bit more. But we got to engage the original languages. You've got to investigate any kind of Old Testament connections. In fact, there's imagery in this passage here that takes us back to some things going on in Daniel. And there's possibly even some New Testament connections going on here too, because in this passage, for sure, there is definitely a connection to Matthew 24. And so the more information we gather, the more we know about certain things, it's going to help us to come to some pretty good conclusions about this passage. However, as you start to look at other scholars, how they look at this passage, in fact, you should be reading how other scholars through history have also understood this. You're going to find out that there's not a unanimity on a conclusion about this passage. And so, even when you accumulate all that, it may not be possible to know with certainty Paul's intent here. Now, this is one of the few passages that is so foggy, I think. In fact, I think this is probably one of the hardest chapters in the entire New Testament to understand completely what is going on. But I do know this for certain. It is not a forecasting of an event for the future of modern Christians. So this has already transpired. So it has nothing to do with us. There's nothing that's going to happen in the future for us. In fact, there's a discipline of the study of the eschaton, or the end of time. It's called premillennial dispensationalism. It is a horrible way to study the end of time, because it only uses English translations to begin with, and it always pulls things out of context, and it's not even a scholarly view of the end of time. It was a production by lay people. So it's a really, really horrible theological position. And so they always forecast things to the future of modern Christianity. It ends up being a lot of American flavoring in this too. It seems to be a premillennial dispensationalism seems to be an American-born error for sure. But Paul's not forecasting to the future for us. He's forecasting for the future for them, and in a really short period of time. Now, Paul mentions the temple of God in this passage. That's important. The temple of God. And he says the temple. He's using the definite article there. So he's not saying a temple of God. So he's not talking about the Christian body. We talk about the body of the Christians being the temple of the Holy Spirit. That's not what he's talking about here. He is talking about the temple in Jerusalem here. He's talking about the temple. That's the one in Jerusalem. Now, it will be destroyed in 70 CE. He writes that 2 Thessalonians probably around 52. So he's forecasting some events coming up 18 years in advance. Now, Paul also does not know everything that's going on. Even though he may have some of this information, he knows it's in the future, he has a good idea of what's going to happen, God has not given him everything. And so we have to understand that also. But this is definitely about the destruction of the temple of God. So the setting is in the 1st century. It's in the 1st century. Now, there's many vague personal references in here too that just don't have any anchoring to a defined noun. You call it a pronoun without an antecedent. And so that makes it very hard for us to identify some of these people or things that are described in this text. So for instance, the man of lawlessness. He's also called the son of destruction. Now, the old King James Version have the man of sin here. That's not a good reading. That's a bad reading. King James Version is using inferior manuscripts when they used it. You got to remember, the King James Version was a production from the 17th century. And you may not know this, but our best and most important manuscripts were not found until the 19th century. So there are 200 years they wrote or translated into the English, the King James Version, 200 years before they had the best manuscripts. So we have lots of problems with the King James Version. But anyway, the man of sin is not the right reading. It's the man of lawlessness. That is absolutely correct. And since it uses this reference to law, I also know that it has to refer to someone who's acquainted with the law. So it must be a Jewish person, or a Jewish idea, or a Jewish group. Something like that. It's Jewish related. Not Christian related, because we wouldn't be talking about the law if it was that. It's some kind of Jewish person who's not a believer in Jesus Christ. He's a non-Christian Jew. Now, there's another part in here. It talks about that which is restraining. In fact, that comes down in verse 6. Your translation may say something like, what is restraining? But it literally in the Greek, it's that which is restraining. That which is restraining. It is a very mysterious phrase. Makes it even more mysterious because it's a participial phrase in Greek. We don't do a very good job with it in English, but it's a participial phrase, and it is neuter, and it's gender. In Greek, there are genders. There's a masculine. Some words are masculine. It has nothing to do with any kind of relationship in the world. So, for instance, I'll give you a good example. Children are always feminine. I take it back. Children are always neuter. They're neuter. They're not given a kind of masculine or a feminine reading. Prophetess is actually a feminine word. So it doesn't necessarily go with what you would think of like the genders in real life. They just go association with how this word is formed. And so they have masculine words, they have feminine words, and they have neuter. This is a neuter word. So it's not relating to a person. If it was personal, it'd be a masculine noun or it'd be a feminine noun. Well, this is a neuter or neutral. So it's a thing. It's a thing. Can't be a person. It has to be some kind of a non-personal agent. So what would fit with that which restrains or that which is restraining? Well, the Roman government. The Roman government would be the best fit here because it is a thing. Now, you might ask me, like, how is the Roman government restraining? The Christianity, in early Christianity, if you look in Acts, and if you know a little about what's going on in Paul's ministries and his letters, the greatest opposition that early Christianity had was from non-Christian Jews. Over and over, they caused problems. And so, the Roman government, though, did not like to have unrest within their empire. So they weren't going to let the Jewish people just go crazy on Christians and just go out there and round them up. Even though Paul had a little time there where he did, it would have been stopped pretty soon when Rome would have found out. But they wanted to keep peace and order. So they are restraining this Jewish opposition to some degree. Now there's also Old Testament imagery here. And this idea comes from Daniel 9 and 12. It's the idea of the abomination of desolation that comes out of Daniel 9 and Daniel 12. Jesus talks about it in Matthew 24. But the picture in here is to seat himself in the temple of God. In fact, it is in verse, give me just a second here, verse 4. To seat himself in the temple of God, while declaring himself that he is God. Now, I'm going to give you a historical time when this is fitting. But what I can tell you is that this is an image of a person who enters into the holy place or the most holy place, and that's a place where they should not be. And so that's what it's referencing about. So in Daniel, it seems that he's talking about a Greek ruler, Gentile Greek ruler, who went into the Holy of Holies and desecrated that area. And so this idea is being repeated that this could happen again. This abomination of desolation that happened prior could happen again. And it does happen again in the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. Now there's also this part in here, and it's towards the bottom. It's in verse 9. It talks about this activity, the lawless one, is being associated with Satan or deriving from Satan. You might not remember, but in the Gospel of John, in fact it's John chapter 8, Jesus actually calls the Jewish people there sons of Satan. Now these are the ones that are denying him. Okay, he calls them sons of Satan. They're stubborn, and so he calls them descendants. No, he says descendants of the devil. I'm sorry, I got it in my notes here. Descendants of the devil. And so he's talking about people who are practicing Judaism or the Old Covenant. People who are still practicing the Old Covenant after the New Covenant has come. So any Jewish person who's practicing this Old Covenant is basically remaining in the Old Covenant is associated with the activity of Satan. Satan is using this in a way to misguide people. He's using a broken system and a lapsed system. The Old Covenant's over. He's using it in a way to delude people. And that's what's happening here. And so Jesus talked about how the Jewish people were the sons of the devil prior, and now we have this idea of this man of lawlessness, which I'm going to propose is actually a group of non-Christian Jews. And so that would be the activity of Satan using Judaism against Christianity. Okay, let's put all this together just for a second. Kind of bring some history in and kind of talk about what is going on. So the setting is in the first century, and it's around the time of the destruction of the temple. And that would be 70 CE, Common Era, 70 CE. So 0 is Common Era, then after that you go up. If you go the other way, it's before Common Era, BCE. And the reason why they use that termination is because Jesus was not born on 0. He was born somewhere 4 or 5 BCE, so our calendar was off. And so instead of trying to correct the calendar, they just corrected the nomenclature, the labels that they gave it. So they gave it CE and BCE. But anyway, so this is in the first century. It's associated with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in the Jewish rebellion from 66 to 70. And so why is this important? Why would Paul be bringing this up? I don't think Paul understands fully what is going to transpire in that destructive sequence. But I think he knows something is coming because of all the opposition that he's had with the Jewish people. In fact, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, when he talks about the thorn in the flesh, most certainly he is talking about Jewish opposition that he faces all the time. It's not a physical malady or anything in his part. It's the Jewish opposition. It is a thorn, hurt, pain in his side. Okay, so the greatest struggle for Christianity early on is this Jewish opposition. And it's Jews who practice the Old Covenant. So after the New Covenant comes in, Jewish people will not accept the New Covenant. They will not accept Jesus, and they continue to practice the Old Covenant, which is the activity of Satan, because the Old Covenant's over. No longer can you be connected with God that way. And so God is going to have to do something to fix this. And what he will do is punish these Jewish people for their disobedience. And that's what he did. And by punishing them, he severely weakened Judaism and made it possible for Christianity to flourish. So after 70, when the temple is destroyed, basically Judaism is destroyed too, for the most part. It lingers on, and it's going to gain steam later on, but it gains more steam much in our modern era in the 20th century. But for a long time, Judaism was just basically, it was gone, practiced by very few people. And so it started to make a turnaround. But one thing that happened after the Jewish people were punished by this destructive force of God in 70 CE, 66 to 70 CE, is that Christianity flourished. It boomed. And so after Judaism is removed, by removing the temple, basically you've removed the main element of Judaism, Christianity starts to flourish. And so this passage is very, very mysterious. And Paul tells us that this is not really an end-of-time event that he's talking about in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. He has talked about the end-of-time event in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. In this chapter, he's telling us what must happen before these other things come about. And so the rebellion comes first, is what he has to say. And so the rebellion must come. And so that's the Jewish rebellion against the Roman Empire in 66 to 70. It must come, and when it happens, Judaism will be destroyed. Now, the person of lawlessness is a label for the whole non-Christian Jewish people, the group. This whole group, the people that have, Jewish people have refused to accept Jesus as Messiah, refused to accept Jesus as Lord, refused to accept the new covenant. These people are basically the man or the embodiment of lawlessness. And so God is going to punish them. This group is personified and labeled. And the restrainer is the Roman government. Again, the Roman government constrained the Judaism to some degree as far as their retaliatory efforts against Christianity, or I shouldn't even say retaliatory because the Christians never fought. It was the oppositional forces against Christianity. And so, but Rome was able to constrain them to some degree, and then God is going to use Rome to destroy Judaism. And so Josephus, a historian in that time frame, in fact, Josephus was a general who fought in this rebellion. He talks about a person, he's named John. And this has to do with the one who seats himself in the temple and calls himself a god. Josephus talks about this guy, person, John of Giscala. Now, John of Giscala was a volunteer militia person. In fact, he was able to gather a group of people, and he was kind of like a commanding officer of a group of people. They weren't trained in the military. They were really crude, just bodies out there. But anyway, he was the leader of this. And Josephus is also a general, and Josephus was actually trained in military practices, so he knew what was going on. And John was not, and John didn't like to work with Josephus, so Josephus and John did not get along. But anyway, Josephus is the one who had to meet the Romans. He ends up becoming defeated, and he's captured by the Romans. Josephus has an interesting history too. I'm not going to talk about him, but I want to transition to John. John of Giscala, though, never really engages the Roman legions. He just kind of retreats back to Jerusalem. And so he's there during the siege. And now in Jerusalem itself, in the midst of the Jerusalem is the temple area. And the temple area is another fortress. So you have Jerusalem, which is a fortress, and then you have the temple area inside, which is another fortress. So as the Romans are starting to penetrate the walls, after a long, long siege, which is really, really horrible, Matthew 24 talks about a lot of this, they're able to get in, and when they do, John of Giscala retreats back into the temple fortress. And then he retreats back into the Holy of Holies. And he's like the abomination of desolation that's talked about in Daniel 9 and 12. So he entered the place where he wasn't supposed to enter, and he desolated it because of it. And he was also a person, John was also a person who claimed to be a Messiah. And so we have this idea of claiming himself to be a god or Messiah, so forth and so on in history. So it fits. A lot of this fits with what's going on in that time frame, and John of Giscala fits with the abomination of desolation imagery that comes out of this passage also. Now, Paul is not trying to say that this will happen immediately before the return of the Lord. All he's saying is it must happen before other things happen. So Christianity God is going to punish the Jewish people who've rejected Jerusalem rejected Jesus, and they're going to end up in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. In fact, if you look in the Gospel of Luke, and I think it's Luke 21, 20 or 21. Anyway, there's a passage in there where Jesus is overlooking Jerusalem, and he weeps about what is coming. He knows that the destruction is coming because they have refused to accept him. And so he weeps over Jerusalem, and he says, if I were a hen, I would have gathered you under my wings, and so forth and so on. And he just weeps about the destruction that's coming upon them. And so this Jewish opposition will be ended. That opposition to Christianity is going to stop, and God is going to put a stop to it. Now again, this is not an end of time event when this destruction happens, but it could be called a day of the Lord. Many times in the Old Testament, a day of the Lord was a time when God's justice was visited upon this earth. And so that's the idea. God can punish people in this time. He doesn't have to wait till the final judgment. He can punish people, or he can punish opposition to the church before the final judgment. And what we found out here is that he punishes Judaism, and Paul's talking about it, even though it's vague. He's punishing Judaism for the opposition that they have presented against Christianity. All right, that's all I have for that. I hope you've enjoyed this. And if you have any more questions about it, just talk to me on Sunday, and I can answer some more things. All right, well, it's been good talking to you, and I will see you on Sunday.